Um, let me just share my screen. Hopefully I can do that. Oh yeah, found it. Okay, let me know if that's visible.
Yes, you're all good.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so yes, my name is Angelica Hernandez, and I'm the archivist for the Digitizing the Barrio Archive project, which is a project of the Puerto Rican Cultural Center, also known as the PRCC. So just for a little bit of context, the PRCC is located on the west side of Chicago, a predominantly Puerto Rican community. It was founded 50 years ago to provide resources to a underserved community in areas such as education, public health, and housing. It was and remains a political force locally, combating gentrification, but also in Puerto Rico as it actively fights for the independence of Puerto Rico. All right. So I did want to start by talking a little bit about what community archives are for those who are unfamiliar or just new to the topic. I wanted to kind of orient ourselves in what this archive is based on. So I wanted to include this quote from a scholar in the field. Community archives are collections of materials gathered primarily by members of a given community and over whose community members exercise some level of control. The defining characteristic of community archives is the active participation of a community in documenting and making accessible the history of their particular group and or locality on their own terms. So
Uh,
as ooh,
Sorry, one thing. Are you able to make it, because they're kind of cut off, the screens are
oh,
kind of cut off. Are you able to make them like full screen?
ooh,
Oh, yeah, that worked.
does
I
that
think.
work okay?
I think that worked on mine.
Can you see my other screen?
That's better. Yes, we're good.
Okay, because I have my notes on this side. Do you see that part?
No.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, okay. So yes, as we know, communities come together in numerous ways, and a community archive can be based on racial, ethnic, sexual orientation, geographic, and other or any other marginalized identities. For community archives, there is an intentionality and there is a desire to make who they are known. Above all, autonomy and self-determination are central to their existence. I also want to highlight a few of the key principles and practices of community archives and to really recognize what makes them unique and subversive. So that includes participation. That's really crucial for us. One of the primary characteristics is that the subjects of the records are making decisions about what materials are collected, how they're described, and what community engagement looks like. It's multiplicity, different voices and different materials are valued in community archives. Shared stewardship. This outlines the ongoing relationship between the creator of the materials and the institution. Community archives prioritize a shared responsibility. So really highlighting community members as experts in their own lived experiences. Activism, that's really close to our work. The work of community archives is deeply rooted in political commitments. They seek to write themselves back into the historical record and take up space they were often systematically denied. So community archives are very rarely neutral spaces, but often have a mission to preserve their voices and histories against real life threats. such as gentrification or misrepresentation in the media, which is both true for the PRCC. They've experienced both. Reflexivity with community archives. There are often efforts to reflect on their own work and theorize about what they do. People over stuff. While material objects have enormous value, the relationships built with community members is what's most important. Valuing effect. These archives value the way the materials make communities feel. Prioritize how they're processed and how people process the intense histories that they depict. It's also important to note that all of these challenge traditional archival practices. Part of my work also means communicating the work we do to others, including interns, volunteers, and community members, about who we are and why we're different. I think this chart is a great visualization that highlights our priorities and those of other community archives, and also community-driven initiatives. So essentially, the community holds the cultural knowledge, and we rely heavily on their experiences and stories and perspectives to drive this project. So now that we've talked a little bit about what community archives are, I wanted to dive into our community archive, Digitizing the Barrio. So the mission of the Digitizing the Barrio archive project is to help build decolonial futures through the preservation of Puerto Rican barrio histories of resistance, solidarity, and community building in the Humboldt Park and West Town area of Chicago. So through many of our conversations, a few goals have remained clear and consistent. As an archive, our primary goal is to preserve the rich and largely undocumented history of this community. Following the footsteps of the Puerto Rican Cultural Center, our goals are never ours alone. We hope that our work here will continue to address contemporary colonial conditions in Puerto Rico and of course beyond. And of course to build relationships with other community archives in Chicago and across the Puerto Rican diaspora and in Puerto Rico. So while documenting and preserving the 50-year history of the PRCC has always been crucial, there were always individuals who were involved in the organization that saved a lot of these materials, but those concrete efforts really began in 2018. This was led by community members, Michael Rodriguez, Margaret Power, who are my direct supervisors and who have really long and deep connections to the community and the cultural center, and countless others. They started to gather those materials from several of the different buildings. And as is common, most materials were stored in basements and in attics. They were stored and exposed to extreme fluctuations in temperature and humidity. Some were exposed to direct sunlight. Others were around moisture and pests. So yes, a lot of these environmental factors speed up that deterioration process. So it was really important to get them out of there. So the primary goals of this phase in 2018 were to survey the materials, identify any organizational structure, and relocate them to a more stable environment. In 2022, my supervisors, along with a few others, received a grant, the Digitizing Hidden Collections or Records at Risk grant from the Council of Library and Information Resources to digitize and make the history of this community publicly accessible. So the grant included digitizing the PRCC's 3 main collections. Collection 1, the collection on Juan Antonio and Consuelo Lee Correger, who are the namesakes the Cultural Center, the Puerto Rican Cultural Center records, and then collection 3 featuring materials on political and human rights movements in the community. And because of this grant, I was also able to join the team. And eventually we moved all of the materials to a brick and mortar location in the Humboldt Park neighborhood of Chicago. When I started, I knew I had a lot of work ahead of me. I had a few immediate concerns, and that was, of course, stabilizing the environment and caring for the materials in a way that actually prioritized preservation. But of course, there were limits. This was not a traditional archive in a traditional archive space located in a university or a library. I had to keep those best practices in mind while still adapting to the reality of the situation, which was a storefront. And I had to do the best that I could with the limited resources that we had. I think we're lucky now that we're at a point in the field where we're moving away from those absolute recommendations. Instead, it's much more important to maintain a stable environment with few extreme fluctuations, which is something I have been able to do. That's meant keeping the temperature no higher than 70 degrees and the relative humidity between 30 and 50, which is nearly impossible during the summer, especially when you don't have your own building, you're working with a residential HVAC system, or you have a limited budget. Just for reference, I use this really inexpensive temperature and humidity sensor to track the internal environment. And I now have a dehumidifier that I'll be using to keep the environment stable during the summer months. As you can see, all of the materials were in boxes. There was really no specific order to them, with the materials from the 3 collections dispersed throughout these boxes. So this gave us the opportunity and really complex task of organizing these materials during the processing phase. So of course, those 3 tasks included the arrangement, which at its most basic level means organizing the materials both intellectually and physically, preservation, taking those necessary actions to prevent and slow down the deterioration of records, and of course the description, creating tools that'll help researchers eventually find those materials. To break it down further, this meant putting a lot of the theory I'd learned in my MLIS program into practice, which was very daunting. So that meant serving each and every box to determine and create an order and find the connections between the materials. It also meant creating the categories, typically by item type, and then breaking it down further chronologically or alphabetically. Separating materials into those categories, removing harmful clips and enclosures if and when I can, if and when the clips are rusted. It's also a very labor-intensive process, so if the enclosure is okay, I kind of leave it as is until until later on when I have more time. And then organizing those materials into boxes, going back chronologically or alphabetically, and then finally labeling those boxes so that I can retrieve those materials later on. My supervisor, 2 additional volunteers, and I have processed 30 boxes, but there's still around 60 that still need to be arranged and rehoused. And the wide range of creators, organizations, movements, and time periods featured requires a really great attention to detail, so that usually slows down the process as well. But as you can see, we've made significant progress. Of course, this is just one small section of the archive, one section that I'm actually very proud of. A year and a half into the grant, we're now just processing the third and final collection, which features materials on the movement for the independence of Puerto Rico and the campaigns to free some of the political prisoners who were actively involved in that. All right. And then I like to link back to those key principles and practices of community archives through our own experiences. As an archivist, I can offer my expertise, but in terms of what the collection scope is, how materials are arranged, and how they're described are not decisions I make on my own. Another tangible example of this participatory archival process is the Collection 1 finding aid, the collection on Juan Antonio and Consuelo Lee Correger. The Corregers were two revolutionary figures who fought actively for the independence of Puerto Rico. Juan Antonio was actually in prison for a long time and they both had deep ties to the Chicago Puerto Rican community. So this finding aid was created in collaboration with Jose Lopez, which is the director of the PRCC, and Margaret Power, who is my supervisor, but also a historian in Latin American history. Both Jose and Margaret knew the Corregers on an intimate level, and they could provide context and knowledge on who they were as leaders and activists. The historical materials could only tell me so much, so Jose and Margaret played an active role in how they were represented in the finding aid through their memories and their experiences. They also gave final approval of what would become of the actual finding aid in the end. One of the key gaps in our collection remains Consuelo Lee Correger. She is the wife of Juan Antonio. We have very limited materials on her or her work, which is something we hope to correct further down the line. But in the meantime, we wanted to make sure that she was represented as a leader in her own right. Margaret, my supervisor, had done a lot of research on her before and could provide a more in-depth biography on who she was. So this document, this finding aid, a testament to their combined intimate knowledge of the Puerto Rican community, which really helped enrich the finding aid. Another principle is people over stuff, which is also very important to us. We've had the pleasure of being a resource to two local high schools, the first being Roberto Clemente Community Academy, where we were able to introduce our project to students and outline the importance of archives. We also hosted students from the Chicago High School for the Arts to discuss their own oral history project, explain archival processes, and explore how archives can also be used in their own artistic practices. While we hope to be a repository for the tangible history of the community, our commitments don't end there. As a community archive, we want to be a resource to others. By providing the space, tools, we hope that the community will use this archive as an active site of history making rather than solely for passive reflection. Through this work and through workshops and other community events, we hope to activate and start training the next generation of citizen archivists so that they can fuel and expand on the memory projects here in Humboldt Park. And then finally, I wanted to highlight this symposium that we put together in April of this year. It was a 2-day symposium that brought together archivists, cultural organizations, and other memory workers to highlight the importance of preserving Puerto Rican history. The goal of this symposium was to convey that archivists have a responsibility to counter dominant narratives by amplifying marginalized voices. We had numerous panel sessions and a community archive workshop where community members could bring in their own family archives. We gave them instruction on what historical information to document, to provide context to their materials, and how to properly house their items for long-term preservations to start getting the community thinking about what it means to protect those materials and keep them safe. So one of the most fulfilling parts of all of these experiences is knowing community members with limited knowledge of archives walk away feeling empowered. They can also preserve their own family histories and that their stories matter. But yes, that is all I have.
Yay, thank you.
Thank
I
you.
guess we also right now have time for questions. If people either want to raise their hands, feel free to also just come off mute. If you want to just put things in the chat, I can also read them out. But yes, thank you so much for sharing. I know I personally am very curious about how your like MLIS experience kind of like how you see that kind of coming into play of like yeah like what from graduating to getting this job kind of like that in between phase of like especially with like community archives I feel like being uh like counter intuitive to like the traditional archival stuff that I feel like we do learn like obviously some programs also touch on community archives but right like yeah how you I don't know it's like it's the thinking has evolved from like the program to actually being in the weeds, in the processing, in the boxing.
Yeah, absolutely. I believe my MLIS program um, did prepare me. I had a lot of the theory to back up a lot of the actions that needed to take place in order to make sure that we didn't lose any more materials. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't scary to be the first. I really was walking into um, uh, the very beginning of an archive, and we had to build it from the ground up, which nobody tells you that that's an option when you're in an MLIS program. I imagine that I would uh, start at an entry level position where maybe I would work up to these steps of uh, the preservation or the processing or creating a finding aid. I had some of that theoretical knowledge, but I was really put to the test in this situation. But I knew I would learn so much being in this position. Um, but yes, I did feel that my MLIS program prepared me, but it can only do so much. Like that's why they say like the experience you get being in the archive and encountering these really difficult situations is ultimately what makes you an archivist. So it was an intense process, and it still is. But luckily because the field is so large and so vast, there is the culture of sharing knowledge. I don't think any one archivist, none that I've met, that has all the answers. No, they have a group of archivists that they went to school with, that they've met at conferences, that they can rely on for collective knowledge because we all work in different spaces. with different communities, with different materials, and we're all encountering something new all the time. So I think that's just the nature of the profession, thankfully, because I've run into a lot of situations where I really didn't know what to do, but I had other people that I could ask and get their guidance on some of these tougher situations.
Well, we do have a question. We have a few questions in the chat. One person, Sibel, has said, I love the people over stuff ethic. So important. How was that arrived at? And can you say a little bit more how that is implemented or centered?
Yeah, I definitely can't take credit for that idea. That was Caswell, um, who really kind of outlined those key principles that she was seeing in all of these different community archives. But for us, people over stuff, we really prioritize, for us, it's not doing these workshops about preserving their own family histories and archives. It's not about us being the eventual repository, although it is an option. They can always donate those materials. But for us, it really means like, oh, that the next generation of their families or their networks have those materials somewhere that they can have to refer back to. So we're not looking to collect so much as help others and empower others to preserve their own stories and their own perspectives. Yeah.
And Gianna has a question of what's the longevity plan for the archive, especially at the end of the grant period? Who will maintain it and how will they maintain it so that it remains updated and relevant to the changing community needs?
Yeah. That is a really relevant question because we were talking about it today. We had actually this whole week we've been writing our annual report to the grant. We've been looking at other grant opportunities. Unfortunately, for community archives, without the backing of a official or traditional information institution, it is really um, it's we really don't know what the future will hold. We're trying to secure more funding so we can extend the life of the project. But yeah, with autonomy comes uncertainty. And that's something that we deal with on a daily basis. There is another institution in the neighborhood. It's actually the National Museum of Puerto Rican Arts and Culture, who is also an emerging institution who are working to get accredited as an official museum and create their own archive. So we're working closely to make sure that if for any reason we can't continue this project in our hands, it'll remain in the community, looked after by community members. We really don't want to donate this material to a university, to another repository. We want to keep it in the hands of the community. So that's something we talk about a lot. Is how do we extend the life of this really exciting project, but is just so uncertain when we don't have our own funds.
I guess if no one else has questions, I can keep asking questions. But um, could you speak a little, because I feel like with community archives, the word community gets really, it's like it's such a big term, and I feel like it is like, once you get into like intra-community politics, like I don't know if you have um had like challenges with that of like people either like I maybe difference of opinions about things that are coming up and like how navigating that works and also trying to like be like a um yeah, like a place of like this is for like the community, but it's like I guess yeah, how do you deal with questions like that?
Yeah, this is something we do talk about as well. A lot of the materials that we house have a very distinct political point of view. Not everybody in the community has that same political view, especially when it comes to the independence of Puerto Rico. There are different life experiences. There are different um, circumstances that lead individuals to believe one thing or the other. And so we really, because the materials come from an organization that is very politically motivated, um, that has determined what enters the archive, but we want to make sure that we expand it as well. We want to include other Puerto Rican individuals who have different opinions. So that's not something we've been able to actualize just yet. We're still I'm still deep in the processing of materials, the physical organization of that. We still have to actually digitize a lot of these materials, which is also very labor intensive and very slow. But our hope for the future is to expand on a lot of the stories um, in the archive and continue to be a repository um, for individuals from Puerto Rico and Chicago. Um, so yeah, that's something we've definitely talked about. It's not something we've been able to put into practice, but we want to be much larger than what this grant um, has allowed us to do. And hopefully we can do that so that we can include multiple voices from from this one community.
Cool, thank you. And another question from the chat, is the archive currently available online? If not, when do you think it will be available?
Yes, it is not currently online. We're actually working with a content management system to create a plan to create a public um, uh, online repository. So that's currently still in the works. We're thinking maybe um, in a year. We hope everything or most everything that we have the copyright to will be up and available for research. Yeah.
And another question, were technological skills helpful in digitizing the archives? Are there technological skills you recommend for students to start?
Yeah. Yes, they were definitely helpful. I received a certificate in cultural heritage institutions and then also digital curation. The digital curation certificate it has come in handy for a lot of different aspects. Absolutely, the digitization of materials. And then one of the biggest things that I've run into is creating documentation. It's one thing to be able to actually digitize materials, but creating the documentation so that um, others who come after you, it's not always likely that the same archivist will stay in one institution. People move on, projects expand or change, but to ensure that a lot of that institutional knowledge remains relevant and accessible. It's really about creating that documentation, and I think that's been really important in the internships that I've had, and especially in this situation. Yes, yeah.
Are most of the materials like print material, or do you also have like film, music, or like other kind of ephemera?
Yes, I would say that 80% of the materials are print. But if you see in this picture, there are a few boxes that have VHS tapes. I don't think you can actually see them after all. But yeah, VHS tapes, we have CDs, we have a handful of actual film reels. But I think those we would have to have a conservator look into because they were just in basements for so long, they've started to deteriorate and actually smell kind of weird. So that's unfortunately something we might not be able to salvage. We still have to do the research on that. Um, but yeah, there's a small section of the collection that is audiovisual. There's a yeah, another like 10% that's like artifacts, art that was created by some of the political prisoners, by other community members that have just been collected over the years. But yes, predominantly print materials.
And there was a question, if you could explain more about what you mean by institutional documentation for the technological question, and then also, will the archive be bilingual?
Oh, yes, that's a really good question. Yes, we do want to make sure that the collection and then the content management system and the public facing um, repository is bilingual. That's really important to us that the collection is as accessible as we can make it. And of course, there's so many, yeah, so many Spanish speakers. So we want to make sure that that's available. And of course, yeah, the documentation, that's workflow, any workflows to actually like from turning the scanner on to the end product when you have that digital file being really clear. That'll just help. That's been helpful for me training others. I had one intern last summer who I was able to train. And because I'm kind of running around wearing multiple hats, it was really important for me to have that documentation so that I can pass that knowledge along to someone else. It wasn't just, they didn't have to constantly be asking me questions. They could refer to a very clear document and be able to do most of the work with me doing quality checks, but that there was something that they could refer to that was physical and tangible that would help them through the process. And also decision making, creating documentation about um, uh, the decisions that go into some of these technical processes is also really important.
Towards the end of your presentation, you had mentioned kind of like training citizen archivists. And I was just wondering if you could explain a little bit more about the term and like kind of like what that means. Yeah.
Yeah, yes, our goal once the archival uh, portion of this project is complete, hopefully in a year, we can transition to more workshops and programming to actually start engaging the community um, more fully, more consistently than we have been. But yes, we want to, provide uh, uh, community members with uh, recorders so they can start recording family histories so that they can um, record intergenerational stories and perspectives about what it means to be Puerto Rican in Chicago, so that these initiatives kind of that they grow, that it's not reliant on the archivist to initiate all of these conversations, but that the community also feels empowered to take on some of that work and direct some of the programming that will eventually happen. Um, that's yeah, and be able to provide cultural bearers and community members who are really active in the community the tools they need um, to further kind of expand the footprint of the archive. At least that's our goal. Of course, it'll be a while before we actually put that into practice, but we want to make sure that we're not just a repository where people go and reflect, that people actually use the space, use the technology that we provide to capture more stories before the community, eventually changes or evolves in one way or another. There are a lot of older generations of Puerto Ricans who have very interesting and um, relevant migration stories that we're currently just not able to capture, but hopefully expanding and making that democratizing that knowledge and demystifying archives. We can do that and kind of increase what we're able to capture. Yeah.
And do you have a favorite example of an existing digital archive that serves as inspiration for you that citizen archivists can reference?
Yes, actually, let me just look it up. Um, I really looked to the South Asian American Digital Archive, which I believe is located in California. I really look to Densho, which is the Japanese American Legacy Project. They do a lot of great curriculums that we hope to model one day, so that uh, we can be a resource to schools um, in a much more tangible way so that they can actually start engaging with the materials once that is digitized. Um, which other one? Um, Gerberhardt Library and Archives here in Chicago. They're the largest circulating library of gay and lesbian titles um, in the US. They also have an archive, and I am constantly looking at their findings because they make them accessible and clear, and they're a model that is accessible with the limited resources and the time that I have. Also, I have a few that I'm always kind of constantly checking to see what they're doing in terms of programming, archiving, and digital exhibitions too.
And someone is wondering if you are open to sharing either an email or a LinkedIn profile so that participants can maybe get in touch with other questions if they come up later.
Yes, yeah, that would be great. Let me know. Should I put that in the chat? I
Yeah.
should have made a slide with my information, but I have no problem being a resource if any questions come up, if anything at all. Okay, it is in the chat.
I feel you had also mentioned kind of wanting to do programming or have done programming with other community archives in Chicago? Do you have examples of that or like dreams of like what you were like thinking of in terms of that?
Ooh. Um, I don't have anything in mind, but yeah, I would love to. I don't have the reference for it, but I definitely want to collaborate with other community archives, other small, there are a few small archives, and continue to learn. I know that I don't know everything, and I'll just continue to be learning for the rest of my career. That's what I really admire about this profession, that openness to continue to learn and continue to share um, what works, what doesn't, help each other out. So yes, I definitely hope to collaborate with more of them in the future.
Mm. Well, if no one else has any other questions, I feel like we can say goodbye. There's